Hello and welcome to From the World Up. I'm Holly March, or the marcherwitch, and today we're going to be talking about the genesis of religions. This is the first one I did a poll on, and oh my god, did I wish that I didn't. I've done so much research for this one because obviously, having been brought up in the UK, my experience is mostly of the major six. So I had to do a lot of research into religions that weren't either my version of paganism or the major six that you study in school. So I apologise because I'm going to have missed people out, I'm going to have missed aspects out, but a lot of it is just which is the most useful for world building. Okay, let's get into it. I'm going to start off with Paleolithic practice, before the course of history started and before you can start measuring things by ages. So Stone Age running into Bronze Age. Paleolithic practice is based around what is relevant to them, and this will then carry on into major religions as well. So there are massive regional differences. So it depends. If you live in a forest land, you're more likely to get things like, the herd and hunter concept of the forest and deer being important, antlers being buried with shamans, things like that. But if you're in a desert region, the sun is going to be the most important thing because that's the thing that impacts your life most strongly. If you're in an area of tectonic displacement, then volcanoes and earthquakes are going to be massive deals as well. Excuse me. The commonality here is things like the sun, the moon, and the stars, and then the things that are in the depths of the earth. A lot of shamans used to burrow into caves. That's why people are buried underground in a lot of cultures. Because people went deep into the earth. That's where they believed there was an other kind of thing. And the other kind of thing is up in the sky, is the things that are unreachable and beyond comprehension. The next stage is witchcraft, wise women, shamans, things like that. It's the genesis of medicine, people finding out what kinds of herbs help, and also the original concept of healing of the spirit, of holistic healing, where you're not just working on the medicine and working on the symptoms, but on the whole as well, and making sure that people, obviously, in modern parlance, when you're depressed, you get more colds. Because your body feels under attack all the time, so the immune system suffers. So there's genuine commonality between that. You get more colds if you have depression. So in Paleolithic eras, they used to look after people's spirits. The shaman would be as much in charge of making sure there were no evil spirits in the village as they were in making sure that people felt better if they'd hurt themselves. The importance of this was keeping the world, their world, in balance as best as they could, which then obviously leads into a lot of different religions. In addition to regional commonalities, I want to mention at this stage that religions reflect the place and state of progress in their civilization. If a civilization is very corrupt, people start wanting spirituality. They want like the Puritan aspect, but if they're in a time of great hardship, then the religion tends to reflect gods who are very opulent and who want their kings to be opulent and things like that, and want their worship to be opulent. It tends to oscillate between the two. To continue forward the concept of regional stuff, I want to make you consider that the Nordic people are really, really good to consider. The fact that there's so much ice and ice giants, things like that in their mythology. And again, the Mayans, as I mentioned earlier, they were in an area of great tectonic displacement. So their massive fear and their gods were based in volcanoes, and appeasing the volcano with sacrifice in the hopes that would restore balance to their world. Now, before I go into more pantheons, I'm going to do as quick a run as possible through monotheism. This might actually be like a monotheism speed run, I swear to God. Okay, let's start off with the one that started it all, Zoroastrianism. They were the first dualistic cosmology, which means the balance of order and chaos, or good and evil, as it later became. The god of Zoroastrianism is based in order, and the evil spirit, angry spirit, is based in chaos. Ahura Mazda is the good guy, Angra Mainyu is the bad guy, but it's less cut and dry than that. The idea is that the balance has to be restored. In his realm, Ahura Mazda, everything is amazing. He can only do good stuff, but on Earth we have to maintain a balance between the two, the civilization, one assumes that is because civilization was beginning, and I think it was the oh God, I can't remember what the BCE was, but it was a long time ago. Civilization is already beginning and starting to harden into nations, and people want a reason and need a reason to obey whoever's in charge. They need a reason to be good people and stay together rather than acting on animal instinct. Yes, I do believe in evolution. Good luck if you don't. So there's a lot of the things that are then carried forward in monotheism, things like the messianic aspect of somebody coming at some point, there being judgment after death, and the concept of a heaven ruled by Ahura Mazda and a hell by Angra Mainyu. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. I think I am. So yeah, people start to crave religion being organized rather than it just being a reflection of the state around them. You also got a lot of concept of this is the first time that angels came into being as almost like the messengers and the servants of Ahura Mazda. And that meant that this is the start of lesser gods being incorporated into angelic personalities, so that people could say, oh no, it's okay, your God is real, he's just an angel working for my God. Which was carried forward and is still being carried forward today. So it's a way of explaining differing beliefs, but also getting somebody in and getting somebody into their world. And also the idea that, yeah, the God is looking after the whole world, but the angels are looking after us, and they'll notice when things are going bad. Okay, let's hit Judaism, and trying to do this in a quick paragraph is not easy, but from a world-building point of view, it started at a time when every city had their own god, every nation had their own god, and that was fine. You basically went to war to prove that your god was better than their god, and their god was Yahweh, and he had a wife called Asherah, and together they ruled a pantheon. And then, because Zoroastrian was rising in what is now Iran, they sort of stole a lot of the ideas and decided that the pantheon would become angels. Asherah disappeared entirely. I'll get into that in a bit. And they became monotheistic, and Yahweh wasn't just the king of the gods, but he was the only god. Asherah is quite similar to Sophia. She was the female aspect of God, but also seen as excuse my cats, seen as a mother, but also a lover to angels, and like the female aspect of civilization. She's kept in with the Gnostics, but for Christianity, she was adapted into the Holy Spirit. Yep, the Holy Spirit used to be female, and that's why it's sometimes called Hagia Sophia. She was the female aspect, but obviously, as patriarchy tends to do, she got written out. I'm not going to go into a huge amount of Judaism. As I say, this is for world building purposes. I really recommend you go into it. It's misunderstood a lot by people who aren't actually Jewish, and there's a lot more equality than you'd expect. So I really recommend that you look into it if you're building a monotheistic religion. It's got a lot of good stuff. So Christianity emerged from shifting the Judaic prophecy round to so that it would fit their leader. It's a reflection religion like Buddhism or Jainism, and indeed Islam, it's people who are tired of the warrior gods and tired of the situation that they're in and waiting for a great leader, and want a more spiritual religion. They want less ceremony and more reflection. They want less pomp and aggression and more, how can I make the world better whilst I'm living in it? It's a reflection, I say, to the Roman gods, by the way, not to Judaism, but because it obviously took a lot, including most of the holy books, from Judaism. Christianity's lack of ceremony was undermined by being adopted by Rome and Greece, both of whom came from cultic, especially Rome came from cultic background. So that influence was forced onto Christianity, which started a lot like Islam, with teachers going from place to place, preaching or writing letters, and it became much more ceremonial. A lot of Mithras's worship was basically absorbed into Christianity. It started off as a very warlike cult, but the two kind of merged, and since they were both messianic, and so that's why there are a lot of there's ceremony, and why the breaking of bread and the drinking of wine became such a ceremony, and also it's believed why transubstantiation started. Do not tell my Catholic best friend I said that. I'm going to touch lightly on Islam right now because it carried Abrahamic belief forward in the same way. It acknowledges a huge amount of what went before. It just puts a different spin on it. the aspect of prophets that led up to the Prophet Muhammad. Obviously, it gained popularity after his death, but it was still, he did have a lot of followers, albeit not in the political elite while he was alive. It was a lot more stark than the pantheonic religions and even the monotheistic religions around it. And it went back to the idea of a preacher going from place to place and just talking about truth and talking about, their truth. Bless the monotheists. Talking about the way that truth and life should be lived and things like that, and expressing a need for starkness and meditation during life so that you are worthy in the eyes of God. It's a really good example of pure religious evolution. If you want to do this from a world-building point of view, the way that it gets starker and starker each time, from the warlike ways of Yahweh through Judaism to Christianity, and then from Christianity onto Islam. Really, really interesting from a purely academic standpoint. Obviously, not that interesting not that clinical from a world politics point of view, but from a writing point of view, it's really, very, very, very interesting. So again, I recommend looking into that. Okay, on to Hinduism next. So Hinduism is at this point of the podcast because it can be considered both polytheistic and monotheistic. It's a really, really good example, again, of religious fusion, since Hinduism's origins lie in the Indian subcontinent of various religions coming together and slowly merging into one religion. It's like a consolidation of religions. They were first a pantheon, but more recently, it's more of the idea that there's a god and a goddess, and they have different facets, different aspects. So you have like the destruction aspects and the creation aspects, and they come from the same dude. It's also been interestingly been influenced by its own literature in the early days. It's kind of like the animated Batman series brought Harley Quinn into the main canon. The literature about and the stories written, sort of epic poems and epic stories written about the gods then became part of the religion themselves. So the religion can still change. Even if your gods are still around, they might object, in your book. But it can still change, because they might accept the fan fiction. You'll be like, oh yeah, I totally did that. Religion does erode and change course like a river. It's always going forwards. It's not a static thing. That's a really, really common religious icon as well, by the way, as a river. But I'm going to get into that a little bit later on. So now we're getting into polytheism. If you're going to if you're writing a pantheon, if you're writing a polytheistic religion, especially if the gods either are present or aren't present, start with the Egyptians. Do a lot of research. I'm not going to talk about them a lot here because there is so much to talk about. But they have the initial thing of the sun and the Nile being like the most important things in their world. The sun could either destroy them in its heat, or if it got too close, kind of thing, or it could give them the life for their crops. At the time, up and down the Nile was an oasis. Everywhere else was desert because civilization hadn't spread outward to other oases in the desert, which, long story. So the Nile was incredibly important. If it flooded, their crops were destroyed, but if it flooded the right time of year, then that would bring up the silt, which would then later on grow next year's crops. So whoever controlled the Nile controlled the country, which is kind of how the pharaohs came about. And because there was so much religious importance connected to the Nile and connected to the sun, the pharaohs had to become gods themselves in order to maintain the level of power that they did. It's not just that they had slaves. It's more that like everybody was a slave who wasn't of the royal family in some description. Everybody served the religion, served the monarchy in that way. I'm not going to touch on that. I'm not going to go into the pantheon itself, but I definitely recommend researching that pantheon, researching the legends around it when you're creating your own religion. Next, I'm going to talk about the Nordics aspect. Like I said before, lots of ice, because winter was the most terrifying thing to them. Because they had a barren land, there was an extremely warlike and conquering aspect among their gods, because they had to spread out. That's why the Vikings became such fearful conquerors, because they didn't have a huge amount back at home and everyone else seemed to have it better. They have very low life expectancy, So death was something terrifying. And in response to that, because of the need to conquer, they invented Valhalla as this amazing place where you got to hang out with the gods and everything was incredible after death. Rather than it being like, the Christian heaven, where if you live a good life, if you are meek, if you are observant, if you are charitable, then you go to heaven. Because in a desperate way to get the nobles to give over that money. With the Nordic religion, it's much more, okay, we need to get these people to fight, so let's tell them that if you fight, you die a really great death and you go to heaven, and it's amazing. If you have a really awful, if you don't die in battle, then you go to this really awful place where you have poison dripped on you for all eternity and things like that. So again, very reflective of the region and of the civilization's necessities itself. Because life was so hard, they have gods who are very petty, who are always messing around with each other, and therefore aren't really concerned with people, and they're often defined either by weaponry or by armor. There's the importance of fruit. I didn't really talk about that in the monotheistics, but fruit, because it was like the first way that people could eat before farming. Fruit usually has a very distinct influence on people and on either as a source of eternal life within the Greek pantheon, within the Nordic pantheon, or as a source of knowledge, which apparently is a bad thing among the monotheistic tribe. So the Nordic one is very specific to the situation they were around. In the same way, the Greeks lived in an agrarian area where their biggest fear was natural disasters. Earthquakes were a problem in Greece. Hence Poseidon being a god of the god of earthquakes as well as the sea, and Zeus being a god of lightning bolts, who would, be a danger, therefore, in storms and things like that. They had a massive focus on learning, because philosophy was a huge part of the Greek thing, because if you have an agrarian society and you have, bountiful land, you got time to sit around and learn stuff. The seasonal cycle, titans beneath the earth, angry gods, all of this relates into, bad weather, bad tectonic displacement. And again, fruit, very important. The golden apple given to the most beautiful goddess. I'm sure there's a basket of, there's an apple tree, right? Something to do with the golden fleece is hanging on an apple tree that, anyway, I don't really remember. But yeah, so again, fruit is very, very important, but it's a very agrarian society. So you've got goddesses like Demeter, hanging out and things like that. Going in from the Grecian to the Roman, this was also an agrarian society, but more like the Nords. It was also a very warlike place. Yes, sorry, brain just completely evaporated. The Romans are a really, really good example of an evolving religion. Another one, really good one to look at. I'll take that just from the what they called the Triad, which is the Triad who were the most important gods in the pantheon, and it obviously started out with the Romans, but then they adopted the Greek religion and the Etruscan religion and Persian influences, and just sort of adopted other gods. It was a Roman thing. Part of what they did as they conquered was conquer other gods and brought them home like trophies, in the same way that they brought back the resources of wherever they conquered. To get back to the Triad, the archaic Triad was Jupiter, Mars, and Quirinus. Jupiter, who has the lightning bolts like Zeus, who is king of everything, and Mars and Quirinus, who were the god of war and the god of basically civic defense. He was basically a god who was also armored and looked after the army, but whilst they were in peacetime. So yeah, very, very warlike. This then adjusted into the Capitoline Triad, which was Jupiter, Juno, and Minerva, and it's one of the only religions that's ever had that much importance on female gods. And again, this is a reflection of the shifting needs of daily life. Minerva is the goddess of tactics, among other things, and Juno the goddess of marriage and stability. So it was a much more thoughtful triad, not just go into war, but think about going to war. And also think about the civilization back home. And it may well have been that the priests were going, we've really got to stop all this fighting because we're starting to fight amongst ourselves. Let's start thinking about stability. Your priests and your priesthood, that will change as well. You can't just always have evil priests. But at any given time, you might have them that are very political and trying to shift things to their favor and stuff like that, because yeah, that happens. So again, it all reflects to the practical needs of daily life, but Rome was possibly the most cultic religion we've covered so far. As I said, they sort of collected gods like Pokemon, and then you'd get the favorite little thing, and like they adapted Mithras from probably from Iran, and sort of made him their own, and decided they were going to have a cult, and they had a cult, and that's just kind of what they did. And yeah, it's almost cute, except for all the fighting and conquering other nations. But again, that's really, really interesting, and a really interesting thing as a writer to do cults and have like everyone be fine with the fact that somebody else has a different religion. Like, oh, you're a Junoite. Oh no, I'm more of a Minerva. The Roman gods at their base before the Nero era of I'm a god. It was kind of like a Hogwarts house. You're like, oh no, this is the person I subscribe to. This is the person I sacrifice to. So it's a more interesting way of looking at things, I reckon. So the next group is the Costumbre, basically religions who are rooted in ceremony and practice, and the ceremony itself is almost more important than whoever they're worshipping. And it's mainly the Mesoamerican religions, Mayans, Aztecs, people like that. I have cheated and not written down any Aztec gods because I don't want to still be recording this on Saturday. So once again, landmarks and the regional area is what influences this at its base. You've got a village that's surrounded by deep bathing pools. So the ceremony is going to be that you go to each of the bathing pools and either drink a little bit of the water or bathe in each one. Or a volcano being over. So fire is going to be really, really important to your religion. And mountains is going to be really important to your religion. It's whatever is around you, where you are, the land itself. And that's because the land gives and the land takes away. So the calendar itself can relate more to the land than to the stars, which is what like the Egyptians, the Greeks, and then us. That's what. Sorry, that's that we. I'm British, by the way. I know my accent's a bit strange, but just if I say us, that's kind of what I mean. I mean the Brythonic Celts. So yeah, so it would relate to when the ground gives up its seed. Sorry, when it gives up its bounty. It could relate to a certain time of year when fires start, because of forest fires and the dryness, things like that, or when the rains start, like a monsoon season, things like that, and that's where the calendar is related to, and that means that the year itself becomes a holy book in and of itself. So you have worship at certain times of the year, ceremonies at certain times of the year, and each day has its own importance. Rather than it being a story that has importance, it's the day itself and what you do on it. It starts in a very shamanic way in keeping balance, but the way that they keep balance is making deals and barter with first the land and then with gods that represent the land. My cat's being annoying. That's why I'm talking strangely. There she goes. Okay, so it's this idea of paying for your agriculture, paying for fruit, paying for please don't let the volcano explode. And usually the way that humans measure what is most important is in life and therefore in blood. So for little sacrifices, you sacrifice a mouse. For big sacrifices, you sacrifice a bull. And for, oh my God, we're all going to die, you sacrifice a person. The way that the Costumbre still put a importance on priests isn't so much like archbishop, bishop, deacon, things like that. It's the priests are most important depending on how important their god is within the pantheon. And again, I did not try and write down the gods' names because I just can't. My tongue doesn't work that way. So it's not cultic separation as in with the gods. It's all of the gods are part of like a long line of who's most important, and that then reflects on the priests, and everybody worships everybody. But as I say, for the first half of the religion and stuff, I think it'd be really, really interesting to have someone write books on like the cusp of people going, oh yeah, the sun, you know how we worship the sun? Oh, the sun has a name, and it's a dude. it's always a dude. The moon is always seen as virtual female because of tides and periods and stuff like that. So, and the way that works. So the moon is always female, and the sun, which is sort of shines and is very, very bright, is always male. Always. Honestly, I think there's like one religion where. Anyway, I'm ranting. Let's go on. So now I'm going to talk about Dao Te Ching. I'm sorry if I pronounced that wrong. I have tried. I promised. Written as Tao in the English alphabet, but pronounced Dao. Because China was way, way more advanced than the West, they had the written word far, far earlier. Possibly because of the size of the country, even at its genesis, in the valleys. It was a huge space, so you needed to be able to write stuff down because it was much, much harder for a messenger to memorize everything, even at that stage. So they had literature, and they had, once you get literature, you get philosophy. But Tao is a direct step from shamanism onward without the need for gods and that kind of worship. It's observation of the world and meditation. It's keeping harmony and balance, but without the need for an intercessor, without needing the shaman to do it for you, without needing a priest to speak to the god on your behalf. It's about maintaining harmony and balance in the world through your own actions. I really recommend anyone reads Lao Tzu anyway. It's a really interesting way of looking at the world, and you might disagree with it, especially from a capitalist standpoint. You might disagree with it, but it's fascinating and important, I think, for anybody who is... I'm sorry, that's my cat. Anybody who's doing world building, read Lao Tzu, read the triads of Hulva, anything that is like the baselines in those kind of literature. They're not as long as you think they're going to be, and they are really, really important to get you out of your own paradigm. But yeah, it's interesting because it came straight from shamanism, but it didn't go the religious route. So it's a completely different way of looking at things. So I know I've only touched on Buddhism and Jainism and glossed over quite a few religions. I haven't even gone into Sikhism, for example. I'm going to stop there because my episode's getting quite long. Things I want you to consider. Have a look into Terry Pratchett's small gods theory, the theory that as believers and belief gets less, a god gets weaker. Look into Neil Gaiman's American Gods. They're making a TV show about it at the moment. So that's a really good jumping in point. The idea that not just conquered nations, but emigrated to nations have all the gods of the people that have gone there. Also consider this. If you have God and Goddess, as many people have before, then you are erasing trans people and non-binary people. You do get gods that have female aspects or who turn into women for certain points. There's a couple of the Roman gods who were trans. But consider it. Consider having a different word for whatever your power is. People are using angel a lot more, because that is largely a gender-neutral term. For example, my good old friend Trudy Canavan, who I mention every single time, the Millennium series uses angel as their force of power. But yeah, there's a good one, powers. Just, call them the powers that be. Because that means that you are not making a trans person or a bi person who reads going, oh, great, it's another dual gender world that I get to read about. Hooray! So consider that in building your religion. Consider the evolution, the fact that they change over time, and think about in the genesis of your religion, what is the most important thing to the people? Is it the fact that dragons keep fighting them? So you have the fact that dragons are considered archdemons or gods in all our old gods in Thedas, in the Dragon Age series? Or is it, do you want to have a very strong thing with ancestors and ghosts, as in a lot of the Chinese folklore religions? Just have a look around, dig around into mythologies, because they are really, really interesting, and try to get outside of your own paradigm. That is the recommendation I was always good. Unless you're going own voice. If you're going own voice, go for it, absolutely. Try and get outside your own paradigm. It's fun. I struggle with it. I'm a shamanic, Brythonic Celt, and I try really, really hard to do this without bias, but I know for a fact that at times those of you who are monotheistic will have got really irritated with me, so I do apologise. I did try, and I also apologise profusely to people whose religions weren't mentioned. Honestly, I don't want to go into another 40 minutes, so thank you very much. I hope you enjoyed it. Bye-bye.
The podcast you just heard was published with Anchor. Got something you want to say to the creator of this show? Send them a voice message using the Anchor app, free for iOS and Android.